What is up, everyone? Welcome back to yet another live stream. This is going to be a live stream where I talk about demystifying design pricing. So I'm back. The last live stream I did was about a week ago, and I kind of like this Tuesdays at 8 p.m. time. So I think I'm gonna try and commit to doing one of these live streams once a week, every week on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Before I jump into it, just a couple housekeeping things. I wanted to just let everybody know that I do plan on doing a lot more of these live streams. And to kind of support that, I did set up a Patreon account to help, support the work that goes into some of these live streams. So if you want to take a look at my Patreon and consider supporting. URL is down at the bottom. It's patreon.com/James Cabrera. So I only have one tier there right now, just $5 a month, and that's just to kind of motivate me to keep this thing going, and also to kind of get some feedback from patrons on specific topics that they'd like to hear about, specifically in design, since that's what I'm an expert in. But I will consider taking other technical topics if I know how to do it. So just take a look at my Patreon link below, and I will be prioritizing topics that some of my patrons would be interested in hearing about. So I do have one patron, and it's Robin, and I did a topic she had requested on podcasting earlier, and I am planning to do another one that she'd requested specifically on mobile design and graphic design, specifically made for mobile devices. So watch out for that. That's coming soon. And for any future live streams, you could check out my website at asrequired.com. So, like I said, I'm going to be trying to do these Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Take a look at what topic I'm planning to talk about the next week by checking out asrequired.com. I'll try to have that updated at least the week before, and then I'll have these live stream links up on my YouTube channel maybe at least 48 hours before I plan on going live. So watch out for those, and if you just want to be notified of whenever a live stream goes up on YouTube, just please consider subscribing to my channel, and you'll get notified whenever I set up a new live stream. Like I said, I'll be trying to do that 48 hours before I go live. But as of right now, I'm going to be planning on doing live streams Tuesdays at 8 p.m. So that's all the housekeeping stuff. I'm going to be talking today basically about demystifying design pricing. And what do I mean? What is the mystery in design pricing? Well, if you talk to either agencies or you try to reach out to designers to get an invoice or get a quote on a project that you have, it seems like for the most part, these numbers, these prices just come out of thin air. And while I'm sure designers are properly evaluating and valuing their work, for some of the clients, especially those who aren't that well versed in what it takes to actually produce some of these designs, some of these numbers to them just sound like they're coming out of thin air, and they don't really know what goes into the prices. And the common thing that I hear from clients who don't really know the type of work that goes into design work, or the sort of factors that go into estimating the cost of a design, they'll just go to the whole thing about knowing that they have a nephew or a little cousin who just knows Photoshop that could charge them cheaper for a design, which is not really productive. But I want to kind of demystify that and get into all of the different factors that could potentially go into pricing of design work. That way, this will clear things up. This could be a video you share to someone you're negotiating with, just to show them that, like, hey, this is why my price is so high, because all these factors are going into it. Or even for designers who are just starting to get their feet wet doing freelance work, how to kind of get to pricing their work, or understanding what the true value of their work is based on the skill that they put into it, or the time that they put into it, or how much they had to hustle because they had to hit a due date. So all those things. So I'm going to basically just be breaking down, from my experience, both being a freelancer and then also being on the client side and hiring freelancers, my understanding of what goes into the pricing of designs. And having this tool set in your arsenal is super beneficial, especially when it comes to negotiating work and also trying to getting good work done within your budget. So just knowing all this stuff will just help you in those conversations you have when you are trying to contract out design work, especially with freelancers. So let's get this started. This is going to be the agenda that we're going to be running with and things that I plan on talking about in the session in order. So I'm just going to jump into talking about designer's choice. You'll see what I mean when I get into those first few slides. The next thing we're going to talk about is time. What are factors in time that can either inflate or decrease the price of some of the quotes you might be getting on design work? The third thing we're going to talk about is specialization. So this is definitely a factor in some of the things that people think about the most when it comes to pricing design work, like how specialized is the specific thing that you're asking to get done. Fourth, we're going to get into some rights and usage. So this is an often overlooked topic that when I've been in discussions about design work, it's often something that I completely forget about without, having it as a clear thing that I need to ask about is how is this artwork going to be used, and what type of rights you're going to need for it. The next thing is relative impact. So when I get to these slides, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but basically talking about, what kind of impact is this design work going to have for the company, or in the larger landscape as a whole. Six, we're going to talk about accommodation. So how accommodating is the artist? Depending on how you talk about it, could either raise the price of work or decrease the price of work. So just, how much extra time after the work has been done is the designer willing to stick with the client to get it into the final shape that is exactly how the client wants it. And then to wrap this whole thing up, I'm just going to talk about all of the things that I'm covering here in specific scenarios, just to give you a clearer idea of exactly what I mean, of how some of these things could either increase or decrease some of the prices that you might be seeing when you get quoted for work. So we'll do a couple pricing scenarios at the very end, and then maybe if anybody has any questions or has their own specific scenarios that they'd like me to run through just to see, whether this is a more expensive or a less expensive type of project, I'd be happy to run any personal scenarios through this as well. So before I get into it, I'll do a little bit of background on myself. My name is James Cabrera. I'm the founder of As Required, which is my design studio, which is basically everything that I create on the side that's outside of my normal work. And for my normal work, I am currently the head of design at a company called The Block, which is a research and news site focused on cryptocurrencies. I was the design director at Gimlet Media, the popular podcasting company, up until the point that they got acquired by Spotify. Before that, I was a senior product designer at Refinery 29, so I led some of the designs for some of their apps and then also helped set up the design system for their website. And before all this, I actually was formally educated at Stony Brook University in math and physics, so this is also part of the reason why I'm doing these videos. I'm completely self-taught in design, and I'm hoping that in some way or form these videos could potentially help the next generation of self-taught designers. So I feel like I'm just paying it forward because back when I was learning design, there wasn't so much out there on YouTube, and I was just so fortunate that there were people out there who were putting resources and information out there for free, even though it took a little bit more effort to search for it and find it. So I'm hoping some people will come across these videos and I could teach you something, maybe help someone out in terms of trying to start or continue or support a career in design. So demystifying design pricing. So who is this talk going to be for? It's going to be for two people. First, it's going to be for clients to better understand the true value of design work. So I've been on the client side and I've worked with people who didn't really understand the design point of view things, and it really made conversations really difficult, especially when it came to wanting to hire people to do design work. So I'm hoping this video will help people out there who may not be that design minded but wants to as a client hire out design work and have easier conversations and more fruitful conversations to get down to a price that works for everybody. And secondly, this is going to be for designers to be more confident in communicating their value. So I know there's a lot of designers out there who just have the question within themselves about, how do I price my work? How do I ask for more for the work that I'm doing? And I think that, if you're more confident in what goes into the pricing of your work, then the more confident you are to ask for higher prices or to get what you actually think you're worth, versus always feeling like you always have to keep discounting your price because you can't really explain what the client is actually getting. So I'm hoping with the stuff I share here, you'll be able to use this to help justify the price that you think you can get with your work. So let's start off by talking about what I'm just calling designer's choice. And this is just kind of a golden rule when it comes to pricing in general. And that is pricing is 100% the choice of the designer. So this talk is just going to be an attempt to make pricing design work more predictable. So if like at the end of the day, you don't have to explain yourself. It'll just help in conversations if you are able to explain where your prices are coming from. But I think designers should ask what they think their work is worth. And they shouldn't, undercut that at all. You should be trying to get exactly the number that you think, the amount of time, the amount of effort that you put into a work. So at the end of the day, it's just 100% still the choice of the designer. You don't have to itemize anything for anyone, but it does definitely help the conversations and does help persuade your clients to actually pay your asking price for your work. So that's what I'm just trying to get at here. I'm not saying that this is the blueprint that all your invoices should have numbers designated to all these components to narrow down your price. At the end, whatever you think your art is worth, feel free to charge that. You don't have to itemize or, justify exactly what goes into that cost. Like I said, don't be afraid to ask for what you're worth. I see this all the time, and I used to do this, especially when I was freelancing early on in my career, is that I felt like I was doing so much work and for just pennies, based compared to the amount of time, the amount of expertise I felt like I was putting into work. I just felt like I never got the dollar amount that I thought any of that work was worth. And I just wish that I came equipped with knowing some of these things, especially when I was negotiating with clients early on, where I could have actually gotten properly valued for the work that I was doing. So I always say this: don't be afraid to ask what you think you're worth. You're the one who spent a lot of time on whatever work that you were creating. You should feel justified in putting a dollar amount against it. So let's talk about the first thing, and probably the most important thing and the most obvious thing that everybody thinks about when it comes to pricing their work, and it's time. Now, time is multidimensional, and I'll get into this. But the most common way people think of time factoring into the price of work is the amount of hours spent. So what are you for an hour's worth of work? How much are you willing to get paid, whether or not that work was good or bad? How much is an hour worth to you? And you should feel free to charge that, regardless of whether or not the client loves the work. They should always be spending for the amount of hours, at least, that you've set aside to dedicate and do work for a person. The next factor of time that might go into the pricing is turnaround time. So when I talk about turnaround time, this is just clearly when is this project due, and if you need this project due immediately, as soon as possible, that will obviously make the price more. And if you are, giving the designer a little bit more freedom in terms of timeline, maybe, this is not due until a month from now, that would probably make the price go down. And the reason for this is because, freelancers especially, they have an unpredictable workload. They may have multiple clients at once. And if you want your project to take priority, and you want that designer to literally drop everything and change their entire schedule for you, that's going to come at a premium. So if you are expecting a designer to get the work that you're asking them to do done in a very short period of time, that is obviously going to increase the price. Now, if you are able to get ahead of things, and you're lucky enough or fortunate enough to work in an industry where your project is not launching for another month or 2 months, that'll give you some flexibility, and you'll be able to get cheaper design work done if you have a much longer time frame. that'll allow the designer to fit you into a schedule that is optimal for them. And that convenience comes at a benefit. So just think about turnaround time. Try to get ahead of your projects as much as possible so you could create that buffer room, and you could potentially get design work for a lot cheaper if you give the designer a lot more time to be able to get that work done and be able to optimally fit it into their own schedules. And then the last thing is demand. So, like I said, freelancers especially will have multiple clients, and some freelancers who are very talented or have a specific style of work may be in more demand. So their time is going to be much more expensive than another designer who doesn't have any clients and is just waiting around, just waiting to get a client and waiting for work. So you need to factor this into your decision as well. Are you reaching out to a designer who's has a huge following, has like a bunch of people just always reaching out to them, sending them emails that they want work done, that they don't have a problem filling up their schedule? Expect to spend a lot more money for designers whose time is in higher demand. So these are any multitude of things that has to do with pricing and how it could be inflated by time. Just think about that. No matter what, you should be spending for the amount of hours that the designer is going to be spending on this, whether or not that art is good or bad. That's whether or not they get a lot done in an hour, or just sit around for an hour. Just think about turnaround time. If you could get ahead of things, be a better planner. That'll actually save you money. And then demand. You'll want to think about it if you are trying to reach out to a designer who's like super popular. Of course, that's going to be much more expensive work than to reach out to a designer who may not have that many followers, or may not be that well known. You'll be able to get cheaper artwork from them because they might be really looking for clients, and they're just sitting around waiting for work to be thrown at them. Whereas like a designer who's more in demand, their time is worth a lot more money because they've got maybe a queue of people waiting to get work done from them. Now that's it for time. Jumping into specialization. So specialization is also multi-dimensional. Now I'm going to talk about a little like a few aspects that go into specialization. But I think the main point here is when you hire a designer, you're really hiring them to be an expert. I know not a lot of people think of it in this way, and this is kind of a weird comparison to make, but if you have a brain surgeon that you have no idea like what it actually takes to go inside a brain and deconstruct a brain and like know what things to disconnect and reconnect, like similarly you should be treating a designer in this way, that they are really the expert in what they do, and you're paying for that expertise. A lot of clients and a lot of people who want to contract out design work, I see them taking this attitude about design in a sense that like they think they're just hiring someone who knows how to use Photoshop, but they want to stand immediately behind them and tell them to move this here, move that there, make this yellow, make this blue. If you're going about things that way, then you do not need to hire an expert designer, and feel free to just hire the nephew that knows how to use Photoshop. And we could tell that your expectations are low in terms of design if you literally just want to hire someone who just knows how to use the program. But in essence, when you're hiring a designer, they know how colors work. They're the expert in like how to choose colors. They're the expert in a certain brush style, or they're an expert in a specific art style, and you're really hiring for that specialization. And that's exactly what that money factor is going into in terms of trying to hire someone that to do things that you don't have to think about. So when you think about the brain surgeon example, you're basically paying someone to do something that you have no idea how to do yourself, or you don't know how to wrap your head around strategy or how to approach it. And you have to think about that when it comes to hiring a designer, is you're hiring their expertise. Now, there's certain styles of design that is a lot harder than others. So, that's how that dollar factor will, either escalate or could get cheaper for you if you're going for a style that you see everywhere, that, everybody is doing, that's very common, and it's not so specialized, then maybe it'll be a little bit cheaper than if you're getting a very specific art style that only one person knows how to do in the entire world. That is definitely going to be more expensive. That leads me right into unique styles. So like I said, if you're hiring an expert that is doing a style of artwork that nobody else is doing, I don't know, maybe because they're more original, or maybe because that style of art is a lot harder to do, expect for the pricing to increase for that unique style. You could easily check this if you just check for like illustrations on Shutterstock. If there are illustrations that are showing up on Shutterstock that people could buy for $5 a piece, and that specific style is just all over the place and super common, you could expect that style to be a little bit more cheaper than for a very unique style that you may not have seen anywhere else except for this one designer that you found that's doing it. So expect to pay a little bit more for someone who's doing something a little bit more original. And the last part, which doesn't really come up that often, but I've been in scenarios where it comes up because of specific designs that I wanted to get for companies that I work for, but thinking about tools and materials. So the most literal example for this was literally, when I was working at Gimlet, I wanted a specific style that was like set design. So in order to execute on, getting photography of a specific colored and specific styled set design, you're going to need to splurge a little bit more because the designer or artist is going to have to actually buy physical materials that he then needs to, manually paint. And then he will be taking photos of that and then using those photos to create a graphic design. So when you think about what you're actually asking for, are there additional tools or materials needed for that person to execute on that style? If you're working with a multimedia artist and, they need to buy fashion magazines to do, cut out collages of, to get this collage style with specific images of things that you want in it, considering that there's going to be an extra level of work, an extra level of tools, extra level of materials that the person's going to need to purchase. So, just know that people who are doing work that requires, a little bit more effort than just opening up Photoshop and just jamming away at it, or just taking out a piece of paper and sketching on it, you might have to expect a little bit higher of a price for that type of work. Now jumping into rights and usage. Like I mentioned before, this is an often overlooked aspect of pricing. Nobody really thinks about it until the very end, until maybe a designer asks the client about it, or after the work has already been done, and then the designer is like, oh shit, they start seeing the client using their design in ways that they didn't think about, and maybe they're just making a shit ton of money off of it in ways that the designer feels like they kind of got ripped off, or that they should be getting a piece of that as well. So you should always be thinking about rights and usage no matter what project that you're working on, and just being very clear in conversation about how whatever artwork that's being commissioned is going to be used. So these are just a couple factors to think about when thinking about rights and usage. So number one is who will own the design. So this is very important. So what I'm talking about here is when, say, for example, a company is commissioning a piece of artwork to be done. A lot of the expectation there is that once the company pays for the artwork, they could begin to start using that artwork and saying that the company in fact was the one that created it, versus the artist by name themselves being the one who created it for the company. So being very clear about who's going to own the design. So the most common thing to think about here is that there's always this kind of 5-year rule that, like, it's kind of the standard where if a company purchases a piece of art, it's normally 5 years the company technically owns it, but then after the 5 years are up, the artist is free to be able to share that work and say that, hey, I'm the artist who created this artwork. Whereas within that first 5 years, the company could freely say that this artwork came from us, it's property of the company. So just being aware of that, who is going to own the design. When I worked at Gimlet, for example, some of the podcast cover artwork, we in paperwork said that Gimlet owned in perpetuity forever, but we still, generously credited the artist who created it. But, on paper, who owns the artwork? It was Gimlet Media. So being very clear about this when you're working with companies, especially with bigger brands, if, credit is important to you, this is a way to kind of negotiate the price where, as an artist, you want to technically own the design and like basically lease it out to the company for 5 years. That's a way to make the price cheaper for the company. Whereas if a company just wants to outright buy a piece of artwork and say, we're the ones that created this and claim that they're the owners of this, that is something that will end up increasing the price of design dramatically. So just think about who will own the design. Is there a time limit? First 5 years, company owns it. Second, and then the rest after that, the designer could then take ownership of it. Are you leasing the design out? Maybe, you want to do some sort of royalty thing or licensing deal on the artwork. Just being very clear about that. This element alone could either balloon the price of design or, make it really cheap and affordable for a company. Another thing to be wary of is where can the design be used. Now, what I'm talking about here, it's a specific use case, but I think there could be other use cases that relate to this. But imagine you're purchasing an illustration from someone, and you're a clothing brand, and you want to put that illustration on a T-shirt, and you want to sell that T-shirt. Essentially, the brand that purchased the illustration could potentially be making a lot of revenue and a lot of money just repeatedly off of the same piece of artwork. So being very aware of that, because, as a designer, you might sell a piece of artwork to a company for, I don't know, $100, but then they could put that onto a T-shirt and sell each one of those T-shirts for, $50 a piece, and they could be making millions of dollars off of your design where you only made $100 or $200. So being very clear about that, if they are going to be using it in merchandise, for example, and they are going to be making money off of your design, you should be very aware of that from the design point of view, and you should, be entitled to getting a piece of that in some way. Or, maybe if you know that this company is going to be doing this, maybe you want to raise your upfront cost if they want to just get all those residual sales off of your design. So think about this and think about how you want to incorporate it into your pricing. But like I said, some designers will ask for a higher upfront fee if they're not going to get a piece of the action in terms of licensing or, getting any piece of the merchandise sales. That's a specific use case. I'm sure there's a lot of other examples out there, but just be aware of it. And then the last thing, and this is the most common one probably when it comes to usage specifically, is whoever the client is, will they be able to modify your design? Now, this is important because, if you are a very talented artist and you're very protective of your work, and you care about every piece of work you put out there that has your signature on it, you're going to want to protect the integrity of your artwork, and you don't want, brands to be hacking away at it and taking pieces of it or completely changing it from your original intention to do whatever it is that they want to do with it. So there are some designers who are super protective of, maintaining that integrity of their pieces, while other designers are more than welcome to just share source files and allow, once they, get paid, the company could do whatever they want with it. If they want to have their designers manipulate it or change it in any way, that is just something to think about. So generally the rule of thumb is, if a design can be modified, that will, increase the price of it, because the designer is just giving up, what the creative intent or the creative purpose of the work they created is. So just be aware of that. And the way to kind of protect yourself in this is to decide whether or not you want to include source files. So, the .psd or .ai, Illustrator, Photoshop files of a piece of art. Maybe you protect those, and maybe for an additional cost, you'll release the source files to the client. Otherwise, you'll be giving them flat files that are much harder to modify, much harder to manipulate, and that'll be able to get you cheaper artwork. So on both sides of the coin there, if you're a client looking for cheaper artwork, maybe you don't need source files because you don't know what you would ever be doing with them. That's a way to get artwork for cheaper. Whereas, if you're a designer, if you're trying to, get more money, more value out of the artwork that you're creating, you could release source files to get a little bit extra money for yourself. So that is rights and usage. Now we're going to jump into relative impact. Now, what do I mean about relative impact? This is going to be a little bit of a touchy subject, but it deals with, working with higher profile clients or maybe work that performs really well. So this kind of might tie into rights and usage, but it is kind of separate as well. But the way I'm going to describe this is in two ways, and maybe I'm going to be able to elaborate on this as I talk about it. But the first thing is going to be business generation. So how much business is your designs or your artwork going to be able to generate? Or, maybe the company that you're working for is already generating at a higher level of business that, any incremental change that your design is going to have on a business, especially if, say, for example, you're working for a company that is making multi-million-dollar revenue. Your artwork is going to be, the incremental effect your artwork is going to have on that company is going to be moving maybe tens of thousands of dollars or $50,000 or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And, artwork that has that kind of impact, regardless of whether or not where the client is coming from, should command a higher value because it is going to be touching much more dollars, or it's going to be affecting, maybe on upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars, or maybe even getting into the realm of millions of dollars of revenue, depending on what kind of company that you're working for. So this is kind of, the effect of working with high profile clients who have a lot of money, because, the people or the business that your artwork is going to be affecting or generating is going to be, of a certain level that if you're selling your artwork, it should be at a similar or relative level to the amount of dollars that it's going to be affecting for the business that you're doing it for. And then the second part of this is, can you measure success? So even if you're working for a small startup, is there a way that you could see what kind of impact your designs are having on the business? And is there a way to incorporate that in your pricing? So say, for example, you did a piece of artwork for a company for some sort of ad campaign to sell a product, and there was an actual measurable way to see the direct effect of your artwork on increasing conversions or increasing sales. And, maybe you set a bar for yourself there and you completely crushed that bar and you made way more sales or influenced way more sales for the company than was originally intended. Then maybe that's a way to get yourself more money because you're able to impact or affect more sales or generate more revenue for the company that you did the work for. So think about that in terms of the projects that you're working on. Is there a way that you could measure success to see whether or not the thing that I create for this company has some sort of relative or meaningful impact that could directly be attributed to my artwork? That would be a way to, kind of negotiate a little bit on the price. Or maybe it is something that happens after the fact that you see, like, all right, if this crushes expectations, then it unlocks, an additional X amount of dollars as kind of like a commission. So always think about relative impact. Like always, the same type of work that you do for Nike, for example, should get you more dollars than, a piece of artwork that you're doing for a startup company that nobody knows about and that hasn't had any revenue at all. Working for big brands or doing design work for companies that will be commanding a lot of dollars should be able to net you more money when it comes to pricing your work. This is why, by default, if you are a big company, you're just naturally going to be asked for a lot more expensive work than for other companies, just because their artwork could potentially be influencing a lot of money. Now, the last thing is what I'm calling accommodation. And this is a sticky subject, especially for on the client side of things. So let me just get right into it. Let me explain what I mean about accommodation. And this is what I'm calling like invisible never end with the amount of rounds of feedback that I get, because I didn't negotiate it early on when I was talking with the client. In the early phases of the work. So this could easily, balloon into endless work that you end up doing for a client. And if you don't lay this stuff out very clearly early on, you could easily get into a hole of just like nonstop doing work and then never getting paid for it, and putting in so many extra hours that you end up not getting paid for. So what am I talking about when it comes to this? More clearly defining, how many rounds of review that you're willing to do for the client, and how much is each round of review going to be costing you. That way, maybe a piece of a design work is going to need a couple additional rounds to get over to the finish line, and maybe you initially negotiated for 2 rounds of reviews, but now the client still has some more feedback and wants some more updates to be done in a 3rd or 4th round. You should expect to charge a little bit more for those additional rounds of feedback. So just thinking about this before you begin doing work, how many rounds of review do you expect to do with your client? And then how much are you willing to charge them for additional rounds of review when you didn't initially negotiate extra rounds of review when you're talking to the client. The next thing you're going to need to consider is the level of client involvement. So what I'm really talking about here is, how hands-on does the client want to be? Do they want to be, giving you a high level of direction and not letting the designer do their own thing, or not allow them to rely on their expertise? This is going to, either increase or decrease the price of design work. So from my experience, if the client wants to be really, really super involved in a project, then that is going to cost them way more, because that's not what a designer wants to do. A designer wants to be able to rely on their expertise. They don't want to, have a lot of friction in terms of executing on some of the work that they're doing. So, they may charge more if the client is really looking to be super hands-on on whatever project that they're working on together. So thinking about that level of client involvement is going to either increase or decrease the price, and it'll especially increase the price if the client really wants to be hands-on and really wants to be involved in a project. And the last thing, I'm just talking about applicable feedback. So what I'm getting at applicable feedback is just thinking about, say, for example, you're a designer, you worked on a project, you pretty much followed a brief, at least you think, to the best of your ability. And then the client comes back and they completely hate it, and they want you to do, for your first round of feedback, to completely redo everything. I think before you get into design work, just discussing with the client, what level of feedback would be applicable for the rounds of review that you're negotiating. So do you want to only do once you deliver that initial piece of art, do you only want to limit the feedback to minor tweaks? Maybe it's just shifting the hues of some colors, or maybe it's just, moving a couple things, like a couple pixels, or are you open to greater feedback in terms of completely transforming or completely changing what you initially done in terms of work? So considering, what you're considering is acceptable feedback for a round of review and factoring that into your pricing, just be mindful of that. So if you are open to completely doing a whole new set of designs, maybe that might be a lot more expensive to open yourself up to that level of feedback versus, only minor tweaks, only being able to slightly change colors of things, or, slightly shifting things like a couple pixels. That's acceptable feedback versus, going completely back to the drawing board and doing new concepts or brand new designs. So that's just, how accommodating are you going to be? And generally the rule of thumb is, if you are going to be more accommodating to a client, it's obviously going to cost them more for that convenience. And if the client wants to be more hands-off and say, whatever you give me, we're cool, as is, that's a good way to also decrease the price of some work for yourself as a client. But yeah, so that's accommodation. Now, taking all this stuff, let's take that into some pricing scenarios. So what do I mean when it comes to these pricing scenarios? So I'm going to just point out a couple very specific scenarios to literally exemplify some of the things that I talked about in terms of these factors, in terms of design pricing, just to make it more clear. And some of these are just really exaggerated use cases, but they kind of make some of my points clear from this talk. Now, the first pricing scenario, say for example, your project is going to be a set of 5 illustrations for a website. And you have 2 different people who are going to be willing to do this. And there is that example of your nephew who knows how to use Photoshop. And then you compare that to a graphic designer who has a bachelor's degree with 7 years of experience. Of course, the graphic designer with the bachelor's degree and then also, 7 years of experience is going to be much more expensive to work with than your nephew who knows how to use Photoshop. Why is that? And that is really because of the level of experience and the level of expertise. So, maybe your nephew who knows Photoshop, you'll literally need to be standing behind them to tell them exactly what you want and exactly where to put it. Whereas the graphic designer is you could just, give them a brief and let them do their thing, and you won't have to take a look over their shoulder at exactly what they're doing. And you're literally just doing that. You're paying them for the time that you don't have to spend. All right, we're back again. So just to wrap that up, these are some of the reasons why: the expertise, specialization, the amount that a graphic designer is going to be able to do in 1 hour is going to be way more effective and may take, your nephew 3 days to do so, because they just have a lot of experience using the programs, and it'll just, take them a lot quicker to do things. And they'll just be much better at it without oversight from the client and less involvement with the client. Now, another example, custom graphic for a shirt. So imagine you're doing this custom graphic for a shirt either for a well-known brand with over $1 million of revenue, or you're doing it for a friend's indie clothing brand. You might expect that, the pricing of the well-known brand with over $1 million of revenue is going to be way more expensive than for the friend's indie clothing brand. Now, this has to do with that relative impact specifically. Of course, the shirt that you're creating is going to have a much higher impact for a brand that's pulling in a lot of money. They'll be able to sell a lot more of your shirt. And you'll also want to negotiate some, rights and usage there, because if they are a company that is reaching a shit ton of people, they could be making a lot more money off of that design than you'll ever make with the money that they'll be getting to you in your invoice. Now, another example is, imagine you're doing custom type styling, and, for one of these is going to be for an article for a news website, and then the other scenario is to use for a logo for a tech startup. Now, the example I'm trying to pull here is, this is again for the rights and usage. Now, if your design is going to be used as an identity for a company, that is going to have much more life, and it's going to have more, IP to it than just for a one-off article on a news website that people are probably going to read for a month or so and then completely forget about. So you'd imagine that doing a custom type styling for a logo is going to be much, much, much more expensive than for an article, just because of the way that the company's going to be using it and for the amount of time that they're going to want ownership over that. And then another thing is going to be custom illustration. And this is either going to be for a clear brief provided by the client, and they're only asking for one round of feedback, or this is going to be for a company that doesn't know what they want until they see something from you, and you're not sure exactly what they want, but you're going to be taking a shot in the dark. So the way to think about this is, of course, the clear brief provided with one round of feedback is going to be a lot cheaper than the client who doesn't really know what they want, because you are going to be very accommodating with them, and you're going to be putting a lot more work into it outside of that initial ask that they asked for. So yeah, that is kind of a couple scenarios, a couple ways to think about how to apply these elements in terms of design pricing in order to price your own work. And that kind of wraps it up for the scenarios that I have here. Oh, wait, I have one more. So imagine you're doing a website design and, it's due at the end of the week versus due at the end of the month. And I think I covered this when I was going through the time, but basically, if you want a designer to drop everything, drop all of their other projects and fit you in and get your work done in a very short period of time, that of course is going to be way more expensive than doing that web design work that you may have a lot more time to do. And it's due at the end of the month. They could fit you into optimal times in their schedule and get you done. That will cost you a lot less than having that designer drop everything and be able to get you a design in a very short period of time. So, I don't think I saw any other questions or any other examples of other scenarios that I should talk about in terms of pricing design. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like this video and also subscribe to the channel. That'll definitely help me out in terms of, if people are looking for information on how to price their design work, they'll more easily find this video if there are likes, and if they're subscribed to this channel, you'll be able to be notified of when my next live streams are happening. So like I said, I don't think I saw any questions come in, but that pretty much wraps it up for me here. Sorry for the couple technical difficulties. Hopefully I'll be able to edit this in the replay and cut those pieces out where my camera froze. But if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll be looking at them and I'll be able to answer them. But otherwise, I'll see you next week. I'm doing these, like I mentioned before, Tuesdays at 8 p.m. I'll post the topic that I'm planning to talk about on my website, asrequired.com. So keep an eye out on that. And if you're subscribed, you'll see the thing pop up 48 hours before I plan to go live on Tuesday. And that wraps it up to me. And